Uh, this is Bob Lockhart, Vice President of Cybersecurity Technology and Research at UTC. I want to welcome you to a webinar on supply chain risk management, and it is sponsored today by Deloitte and by Cisco. So today we've got a longer than usual session. We've actually got up to 90 minutes of really good content on supply chain risk management. I've already looked at the slides and they're super. I think you're going to enjoy this a lot and learn. So we have three speakers today. First will be Tom Ulrich, who is Manager of Cyber Risk Services at Deloitte Advisory. Tom is very well known in this industry. He's worked in cybersecurity for 16 years, and he can brag that he's worked with NERC CIP since CIP version 1 was approved in 2008, and has worked with over 30 NERC entities to understand and implement CIP versions 1 through 6. As many of you know, Tom writes a popular blog on developments in NERC CIP. If you want to find that, just Google Tom Ulrich blog, and it should pop right up. After Tom, our second speaker, also from Deloitte Advisory, will be Larry Kivett, who is a partner there. Larry is the Energy and Resources Industry Leader for the Forensics and Investigations practice. Larry's also got extensive experience with supply chain forensic procedures with third-party vendors. And then our final speaker will be Edna Conway, who is Cisco's Chief Security Officer for the global value chain. And if that's not a big job, nothing is. In that capacity, Edna develops and oversees the deployment of Cisco's strategy to secure its global value chain. The value chain security program spans Cisco's engineering services, supply chain operations, and worldwide partner organizations. In addition, Edna also drives Cisco's cyber and security protection plan throughout its third-party ecosystem. We had hoped to have Brad Singletary at Deloitte also on the call, but he's unable to join us today. So we'll have three speakers. As I mentioned, we have a lot of material to get through. The slides look super. I think this is going to be interesting for all of us. I can't wait to hear it all myself. So before I turn it over to Tom Ulrich to start us off, I've got a few quick housekeeping notes. So first of all, this call is being recorded. Your lines will be muted for the duration of the call, but you can submit questions at any time during the call using the chat window on your ReadyTalk screen. The slides from this call and the recording will be available by next week on UTC's website, which is www.utc.org. Finally, today we have a mix of utilities and technology partners on the call. We also have people registered from France, from Israel, from New Zealand, and from Malaysia. So if any of you are on the line, good, very late evening. So that all being said, I guess it's time to get started. And Tom, if you're there, it's all yours.
Thanks. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Thanks, Bob. You can hear me all right?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, good. All right. Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, why don't you go to the next slide then? Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, right. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. No. One back, please, Bob.
I see them sooner than you do.
Yeah, exactly. I and Larry Kivett are from Deloitte Advisory, which is part of Deloitte & Touche LLP. I want to point out that Deloitte & Touche actually has the largest cybersecurity consulting practice in the world. We have over 2,500 cybersecurity consultants doing lots of different things. And what we are talking about today is two different aspects of supply chain security, which are of interest to the power industry. First, I will provide an update on the status of the upcoming NERC CIP standard for supply chain security. As some of you probably know, there is a new standard being developed and which will actually be finished by next year. And second, then Larry Kivett will review common third-party risks, including those best addressed via advanced due diligence techniques. And Bob, you can change the slide now. Before I start, I know some of the people on the call will not be terribly familiar with NERC or with FERC or with CIP, and rather than just kind of leave you in the dark, I would like to give you a little brief introduction right now. I will say that I can't provide any real background at this point, but you can drop me an email if you have questions, or you could bring them up in the Q&A session at the end. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're part of the Department of Energy, and they regulate, among other things, the bulk electric system, and we'll discuss what that specifically means below. And there's another player in this called NERC, which is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. They're a nonprofit corporation. They're owned by entities like utilities and independent power producers. And NERC's role in this whole process is that they develop and audit reliability standards to ensure that the grid is reliable. And one group of standards, one family of those standards is called SIP. And SIP stands for Critical Infrastructure Protection. So the supply chain standard that's being developed is a new member of that family. And finally, BES, or Bulk Electric System, which we affectionately call BES, is the system of high voltage power generation and transmission that constitutes what people commonly call the grid in the United States and Canada. It's distinguished from the distribution system, which is at lower voltage and is the system used to get the power out to you and me and to factories and commercial buildings and government offices, things like that. So NERC and FERC only have jurisdiction over the bulk electric system, which is the high voltage part of it. And so everything we're talking about here just applies to that system, not to the distribution side. Now, in July, FERC issued Order 829, which required NERC to develop a new SIP standard for supply chain security. They required that the standard be developed and approved by NERC and delivered to FERC by next September. Now, this is what NERC does when they get an order from FERC to develop a new standard, is they put together a standards drafting team, which is composed of subject matter experts from the different NERC member entities. And they did that in this case as well. And that team is currently working very hard on drafting. Right now they're working on the first draft, which will be posted probably in December. Now, you may not know that NERC standards are voted on by the membership. So the first draft will be posted. It will be voted on. And if it happens to pass, that's great. In general, there's a pretty high bar for passage. It's much more than 50%. And so there will be, I'm sure it's not too likely it will pass, and so it will come back and there will be comments, and the drafting team will try to address those comments, and then there will be a new draft posted, and that may even happen a third time. So in any case, the team will be finished by next September, because that's when the deadline is from FERC. And the team, when they met, decided that a single standard would be the right way to do it. So they're going to have a single standard called SIP 013. The current SIP standards are numbered SIP 002 through SIP 011, and they address cybersecurity. And then there is also a SIP 014 now, which is a physical security standard just addressed to substations. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. SIP 013 will apply to NERC entities that own high, medium, or low impact BES cyber systems. So without going into a lot of detail, BES cyber systems are that's the main thing that SIP applies to. And they're defined as systems that have a high impact on the bulk electric system, on the grid. And they are classified into high, medium, and low, but we don't need to bother with that here. So the standard requires the entities to develop and implement a supply chain risk management plan. And in FERC's order, they specified that they wanted 4 specific goals addressed in the new standard, and therefore each entity's plan will need to address these 4 goals, and we'll discuss those goals in subsequent slides. Now note that SIP 013 will be a non-prescriptive standard, and that's somewhat different from the other SIP standards right now. So the way I describe a non-prescriptive standard is that the entity needs to address particular goals, but the exact means used to address them are not prescribed. And so the drafting team will provide a lot of guidance, and other entities like the NERC regions, there are 8 NERC regions which do the auditing and outreach, and they will, I'm sure, have lots of webinars and seminars and things on this as well. But the actual means will be really up to the entity on how they comply with this, with the, of course, caveat that they will be audited, and if the auditor thinks they have not really addressed the goal, then they will have to do something to fix that. The drafting team, of course, will provide a lot of guidance. The standards will also be risk-based, so that the entity will not have to do the same things for a very important system like their energy management system, which, as everybody here who's from the utility knows, that's the system that really runs the grid, at least in at a particular utility, and that system obviously has to be protected to a much higher level than other things which might just affect a portion of one generating plant or particular low voltage line, something like that. So you will have to put your money and your effort on the higher impact things and much less effort or money on the low impact ones, which is the way it should be, in my opinion. Next slide, please, Bob. So the first of the 4 goals that FERC ordered and which will be in the standard is verifying both the identity and integrity of any software or firmware that is installed on BES cyber systems and a couple other categories they have: physical access control systems and protected cyber assets, and I won't go into what those mean. But this includes the original software as well as any patches or upgrades. So what you have to do is when you install a new package or when you install a patch or when you install a new firmware, you have to verify, you have to have a means of verifying that what you are installing is exactly what came from the proper source, that it really did come from the vendor that you thought you were buying it from. And number 2, that it has not been changed in transit. So there are technical ways to do this, like digital signatures, but there are also non-technical ways to do it. Again, the standard is not prescriptive. It not says you have to have digital signatures for everything you install. It's just saying you have to have a means of verifying the identity and integrity. And it will be up to you to decide what makes sense in each particular case. And in some cases, if it's very low risk software, you may just say it's not worth worrying about. We're sure it's okay and it's not going to be a problem if it's not. I'm speaking my own opinion there, but again, you're not going to have to do this for every one of the 50,000 pieces of software you have installed in your in your OT environment. So and this will apply to operating systems and main applications, but also to other software like device drivers, utilities, etc., that you might tend to overlook otherwise. And again, since it's risk-based, you don't have to make the same effort for a fairly unimportant system as you do for a really critical one. So next slide, please. The second goal is remote access controls for vendors. You may ask, now how does this differ if you're subject to SIP? already, you know about SIP 005 requirement 2, which is remote access controls. So how is this different from that? Well, first is that machine-to-machine access is covered, not just interactive access, that is by a person sitting at a keyboard somewhere. And in SIP 005 R2, it just covers interactive access. So if a person comes in to an electronic security perimeter, which surrounds all the cyber systems, and they are then subject to all these controls that are in that requirement. However, if a machine comes in, again, to a machine within the electronic security perimeter, that's totally out of the scope for the standard. And FERC, and to be quite honest, a lot of other people, thinks this is a hole that needs to be patched. And so rather than require that other requirement to be patched, to be rewritten, they're asking that this new one definitely include that. So you will need to cover machine-to-machine access as well as interactive access. Second, you have to monitor remote access sessions, again, both machine-to-machine and interactive. And last, you'll have to be able to detect and respond to unauthorized activity. So whatever you're doing to monitor, you've got to be able to, if your monitoring shows you that something unauthorized is going on, you have to be able to detect that in the first place, and then you have to have a means of responding. Typically, it would be by shutting down the session. But those of you who are experienced with cybersecurity know that when you talk about monitoring, detecting, responding, those are not very, they can cover lots of different things. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion of what is going to work, what's not going to work, and what's appropriate in one case versus not appropriate in another case, et cetera. My guess is this is going to be a pretty big deal, to be quite honest. It's going to be a significant effort. And but keep in mind, again, that it's a risk-based and a non-prescriptive standard. So it will be a significant effort, but the effort will be focused mostly on the really important software rather than every piece of software that you ever had installed in your ESP. Next slide, please. The third goal is having security planning controls to address risks in information system deployment. And that presumably means development. So if you're developing software, you also have to have controls to make sure that it's developed properly. You will have to assess risks that a third party might introduce and then evaluate methods to address these risks. Now, most people, when they think about this, they think, oh, well, we're going to have to go out to the vendors and beat them over the head and make sure they have done all this stuff. And in some cases, you will have to do that. You'll have to, look at how they perhaps develop an important piece of software and make sure that, they weren't introducing unnecessary risk into this. But what FERC is really aiming at, or certainly what they talk about in their order, is not anything to do with the vendors. It's you. It's you, the NERC entity, and they are worried that you will make risks, you will make errors as you deploy new systems. And their primary reason for saying this is the Ukraine attacks. Now, I won't go into that much, but most of you probably already know this, but if you don't, in last Christmas, actually, Christmas Eve, I believe, there was a cyber attack on 3 or 4 utilities in the Ukraine, and it caused an outage of which affected close to 1 million people and went on for, I think, 4 to 6 hours, which was fortunately not terrible. So one of the causes of this, and there are a number of things that should have been done better, but one of them was that some of the systems were deployed in an insecure fashion, and they could be penetrated when they shouldn't, which allowed the attack to succeed. And so network security, and in particular separation between what's called the IT network, and then the OT, operational technology network, which is where all the stuff that SIP regulates is on. There will, you're going to have to look and make sure you've deployed these things properly. And again, there's nothing prescriptive about this. You have to have controls, and those controls will be reviewed, and you have to, they have to make sure that if you see there's a risk somewhere, you've taken steps to mitigate it. But, this is an important goal. And let's have the last slide, my last slide, Bob. Okay, the fourth and last goal is procurement. Oh, please go back, Bob. That's Larry's slide. Okay, Bob, can you go back one?
Yeah, I did. I'm on the fourth goal. Are you not seeing that?
No, I'm seeing the following slide from Larry. Okay, now we're at the third. There you go. This is it. Fourth goal is procurement controls, to verify vendors follow particular security controls. Now, when most people think of procurement controls, they think of contract language, and they think, oh, great, we're going to have to go to every one of our vendors and make them follow all this language and promise to sue them if they don't do all these things, and it's going to be a real mess. Well, you can use contract language, although you're not going to be required to revise any existing contracts. That's built into the standard where it says that. But you're not limited to doing that. You might be able to just have an agreement with a vendor, and you would sign something separately. We will do these things. So I don't think it's going to be a big problem from that point of view. And also what's being required of the vendors is pretty minimal stuff, in my opinion, which they all ought to be doing now regardless. So I'm going to go through these four areas that are in this fourth goal, and then I'll turn the presentation over to Larry. The first is notification of vendor security events, which typically would be if there is a new vulnerability discovered. They're supposed to tell you about it, which hopefully every vendor is doing now. The next one is notification of applicable personnel changes. If you've had somebody working at your site for 6 months installing a new software package and he leaves that vendor, the vendor needs to tell you right away so you can disable their access. Disclosure of known vulnerabilities. Again, this should be something that every vendor is doing now. But if not, they definitely will have to after this. And then coordination of response to vendor-related security incidents. So if there's a real big vulnerability discovered and systems have to be patched right away, the vendor just isn't going to throw the code over the wall to you and say, well, go and have fun, but don't call us if you have problems. I mean, they have to work with you to make sure it does get properly addressed. And so I will be glad to discuss this further. I do want to point out one thing, which is that what I'm saying in this about the new standard is based on a draft from a couple weeks ago. I haven't seen anything since then. I know there will be more modifications, I'm sure. And so it may not correspond exactly to this, but I'm also fairly sure it will be very close, because this is pretty much what that NERC was ordered to do. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Larry.
Hey, Tom?
Yeah.
So while you were speaking, we had two kind of questions come in. Do you mind taking those real quickly?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the first one, it's kind of a statement, but I'd be interested to hear your comments. Someone wrote that said the non-prescriptive approach sounds similar to the maintenance rule in nuclear power, which says licensees, and then in quotes, shall monitor the performance or condition of structures, systems, or components against licensee-established goals in a manner sufficient to provide reasonable assurance that the structures, systems, and components are capable of fulfilling their intended functions. Does that sound like what you're seeing?
Yeah.
In other words, pardon?
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that regulation, but yeah, I mean, that's exactly, that's how a non-prescriptive standard should read. it tells you what you got to do. It tells you the goal you've got to achieve, but it doesn't say, you've got to follow exactly these steps, and God help you if you deviate 1 inch from what we say, we're going to throw the book at you. I mean, unfortunately, this prescriptive approach is not working. It's very wasteful, and I could speak for 2 days on this subject, but it's just a very wasteful approach, and it is one reason why SIP causes so much heartache, because a lot of the money that is spent on SIP compliance goes solely to meeting the very prescriptive timelines and things, and it doesn't really go to cybersecurity, and most NERC entities realize this. So that's why a non-prescriptive approach, I think, is a much better way of doing cybersecurity regulation.
Okay, thanks. The second question is from the same person, actually, was a comment that machine-to-machine access, which you talked about, could potentially be the outcome of embedded malware. So that's another reason to be looking at that. Is that how you read it, or?
Oh yeah. I mean, the whole problem with machine-to-machine access is that you are hoping the machine isn't compromised on the remote end, because if it's compromised, the whole idea is, there's some device, something that the vendor has to do within your electronic security perimeter, and it requires that they have direct access in there, and maybe it's applying some software patch directly to a particular system. And so there's a machine sitting at the vendor, and you just better pray right now that I mean, I'm sure they have good controls. It's not like they don't. But you better be very sure that machine has not been compromised, and of course you don't know that. So there should be controls for machine-to-machine access, because if it's not, then that machine could still get in. I mean, the machine is permitted to get in now, and it could get into the electronic security perimeter, and then pretty much the game's over at that point. They can do whatever they want to affect the grid. So, it's always been a hole that's been in there. It's caused a lot more attention lately, and FERC saw this as a good way of addressing it in this new standard.
Okay, so one more just came in. I'm going to ask you to answer that, and then we'll go on to Larry.
Okay.
Question is, the slide we're looking at right now, the 4 goals there, those should be included in new contracts as specific language, and if the answer to that is yes, what do you do with existing contracts? How would you cover those off if you've already got?
Well,
go ahead.
Existing contract, in the requirements right now anyway, and I presume it will be in the final draft, it specifically says that there is no need to go back and modify existing contracts. And to be quite honest, as I said already, you don't necessarily have to do this in contract language. There are other ways to do it. Some sort of agreement outside of it, or maybe just a handshake. Because these 4 areas, they're all part of the 4th goal, but these 4 areas that are on the screen right now, none of them are things that most vendors shouldn't be doing already. I mean, if you have a vendor who's not today notifying you of any security events, I think you need to get a new vendor, to be quite honest. So I don't think there's anything here that they should object to. And if they do, then I would suggest you find a new vendor.
Okay, yeah, that's real world stuff. Okay, thanks. So you want me to move on to Larry's slide?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, here we go. Okay, Larry, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Bob. Can you hear me all right?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Great. Well, thank you again for having us, for having Tom and I present today. I wanted to actually kind of walk through a broader set of a risk discussion. Tom focused a lot on cyber, and I'll certainly touch on that over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. But from a broader supply chain perspective, certainly supply chains are becoming and have become completely global in nature. Certainly there are increasing complexity there that drive different risk characteristics that companies are facing and have to deal with. And many of our clients are focused on how do they better address those risks. Historically, there have been processes and procedures in place, many of them manual, but there's an ongoing focus around how to automate and use things like data analytics and persistent monitoring in order to better manage these risks and get better visibility into the supply chain, earlier warnings of potential issues, not just strictly from a logistical supply chain perspective, but from a compliance perspective as well. In my work, I'm often working with general counsels and chief compliance officers, as well as supply chain professionals around these third-party risk areas that we'll talk about. And so there's always kind of the symbiotic relationship, if you will, between legal and compliance risk and then logistical issues that can come from working with third parties. And recently, Deloitte conducted a global survey of about 170 organizations, specifically to explore issues around supply chain risk. And this covered not just the power industry, but covered a variety of different industries from energy and mining, oil and gas, to retail, consumer products, and manufacturing. So it was quite a broad-based survey and respondent base. And the results of that survey were interesting, and this slide here, in one slide, kind of summarizes some of the major highlights that came out of that. And it was of interest because there was such a broad base of disruptive events or risk history with these respondents. Fully 87% said that they had had some type of a disruptive incident dealing with a third party in the last 2 to 3 years, and 28% had actually faced a major disruption that had a significant financial, operational, and compliance impact on their business, and 11% had actually experienced a complete third-party failure. That could have resulted in anything from shutdown of the manufacturing line to a product recall or other issues coming out of a failed third-party relationship. So certainly, that highlights that the risks are high. But even more telling was that roughly 90% of the participants or respondents indicated that they only had a low to moderate confidence in their overall abilities to manage risk processes, and had low to moderate confidence associated with the tools and technologies that they use to identify and manage risks. So as a result, there was a huge gap that was identified between what companies aspired to do as it related to managing third-party risks and what their actual abilities were. And that's why there's, I think, now emerging interest in what some of the leading practices are in risk management. How do you leverage data and technology and tools in order to be able to better vet the third parties that you're operating with and get better visibility and insight along the way. And before we move off this slide, I just mentioned if anyone's interested in receiving a copy of that broader survey, it's certainly available for distribution. And I think my email address is included within the deck that'll get distributed out by Bob later, and anyone can contact me, and I'd be happy to provide a copy of that. Bob, if you could just maybe move on to the next slide then. So what are some of the risk examples that I'm talking about? Because certainly crises or disruption within supply chain can originate in a variety of different ways. Certainly cyber's at kind of the top of the list as it relates to potential issues that we're seeing within the marketplace, not just in the power industry, but within others as well. And Tom went into great detail around the emerging regulatory environment and reaction associated with that. Cyber incidents can take a variety of different forms, be it denial of service attacks or other hacking events that can have just a crippling impact on an organization. But something to keep in mind here is that attack may actually be against one of your third parties, and that could actually have an impact to your business as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be directed at your organization, but could be directed at a third party that you have a high degree of dependence on. And so having better visibility and better understanding of where some of those dependencies lie, certainly help with upfront planning around how to manage through some of those potential challenges if a third party would go offline due to a cyber incident. And then there's obviously other types of risks that are out there, and I'm not going to touch on all of these, but changes in laws and regulation around anything from environmental to labor laws can impact your supplier base. We've seen that, for instance, with like conflict minerals and just reporting that is required associated with that for various organizations, where they have to get a much deeper understanding of the type of sourcing activities and origination of sourcing for conflict minerals for a variety of different manufactured goods and equipment. And then always, and this is an area that I spend a lot of time on, is just corruption and bribery risks. Those are always going to be present whenever you're dealing with a particular third party. That could be anything from kickbacks to bribery. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act comes into play. For the power industry, a lot of the concerns here are more around local corruption or internal control breakdowns as it relates to the procure-to-pay process. And the risks of kickbacks and issues during that particular cycle of contract identification and payments to third parties. Maybe go to the next slide then. So to better manage complex supply chains, companies are really evolving their risk management tools and processes. If you recall the first slide that I showed, there had been really historically a lack of confidence around the tools and processes that were used for monitoring third parties. And I think that's oftentimes because what we have seen in the past is really the only time due diligence would be done on a third party is at the point where a contract was entered into, or at the point where a particular organization is first starting to do business with that particular third party. And that's usually where legal and the compliance organization would come in. They would do their initial due diligence, survey questionnaires and things like that to get an understanding of who the third party was. The business would supply the business case as to why they wanted to work with that particular third party, and legal and compliance would take that information into account. You would do an initial due diligence around that particular third party, get an understanding of who the business principals were, whether or not there were any potential flags or issues that came out of the diligence process. And then that information would basically be put on a shelf, and it would be archived in case it needed to be referenced back to. But the business, once the relationship was approved, would go along their way. They would contract with that particular party, start to procure goods and services, and all of the standard invoicing processes and purchase orders that go along with that. And then that information would go to accounts payable. Perhaps they do some limited checks, mainly around pricing as it relates to were you being charged the correct items or for the correct items and at the correct rates. But there were all of these things operating in silos, and there was never really any cross-communications between these functional areas of the business. And then there was never really any follow-up to the due diligence itself. And what we're really seeing is an evolution around what we call persistent monitoring. So this is not real-time monitoring or in some cases even near-time monitoring, but the thought being that persistent monitoring is required in order to continue to vet third parties, look for any major changes in, say, organizational structure or things like that. Because certainly the third-party environment, the third-party organization you're operating with can experience significant change, and that can open you up to particular risks, either from a legal or a compliance perspective. And obviously now there's a lot more information and data that's just out there. So for instance, when we look at persistent monitoring activities, there's about 80 different databases that we touch as we look through everything that's included on this list here on the slide. And that's anything from new lawsuits or pending judgments that may be levied against a particular supplier, public information as it relates to violations of regulations, particularly in the environmental health and safety space. We take into account information around social liability like conflict minerals, as I'd mentioned before, or child labor. And social media is also a highly emerging and frankly a treasure trove of information as it relates to compliance-related issues. And so a number of different organizations are looking to leverage these types of data sets and really automate the process of ongoing due diligence such that it's not just strictly a one-time event, but something that is persistently done over time. Some of these information sets can be refreshed daily. They can be refreshed weekly, depending on the frequency of the information need. But it allows an organization to move beyond just strictly a manual process and really leverage some data analytics and data testing in order to be able to fully vet and understand who the third parties are that they are operating with on an ongoing basis. So Bob, with that, I think I'll pause and turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Larry. So one question that came in somewhere, I think it was actually when Tom was speaking, but wanted to get through your material here. The proposed standards that we're seeing here, and I think, Tom, you may be the one to answer this, are they retroactive to all hardware, software, or is it just going forward basis? I think I know the answer, but it'd be better for you to say, Tom or Larry.
Well, yeah, no, I'll talk about it. Again, it's non-prescriptive, so you're not required to do something particular for everything. So I don't know whether I would find it hard to believe that. No, my guess is you will not get assessed a violation or a potential violation for not having done a proper assessment of your EMS system when you implemented it 2 years ago. On the other hand, I would maybe recommend you do that, and it was probably done in most cases. So no, they won't apply to. They would only apply to new software that's contracted for. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if the auditors at least are looking at more than that, and they won't be able to issue a violation if you haven't done something regarding existing software. On the other hand, the NERC auditors have areas of concern they can bring up, which go beyond the standards. They can bring up anything they want, and an area of concern isn't an obligation, but you would be well advised to listen to what they say and try to address it as best you can.
Okay, thanks. So Edna is setting up to share directly from her screen because she has some really cool looking screen builds on hers. So Edna, are you there? Excellent. Okay. And one more thing before you start. In the slide deck, we skipped a slide that's got contact information for the Deloitte speaker. So that will be in the deck if you need it. And there's also ways to find them through me. So Edna, it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thanks. Well, it's certainly my personal and Cisco's privilege to be here and really appreciate being around experts such as Larry and Tom. Thanks a million for having us. So there were a couple of questions that I saw that I definitely want to address, but I want to give you a little bit of background, right? So I think that this particular industry lives in a world that understands the convergence of IT and OT in a very unique way. Not every industry, as we have seen to date, is as intimately familiar with that convergence. But for us at Cisco, what we've really tried to think about is the reality of that. And what it really means is we need to think about convergence in the business models of our customers, in how we offer solutions to our customers, and then what we call the value chain, of which supply chain is a part. I think there's an important thing that we all need to do when we're addressing cyber, and you look at what SIP is doing right now, what NERC is doing with the new SIP standard. Larry went through it, but remember that it's really focused on cyber in the supply chain, which is very interesting. And I think if you listen to what Tom said, you really need to think about resilience in a holistic way. Right? So cyber is one piece of the resilience story. We need to make sure we're addressing it, but it needs to be addressed in an integrated fashion across the full spectrum of the risks that we see throughout the value chain. So for us on the cyber side, we really need to understand what the threat is and suggest to our customers that they too need to think about that. And I'm not going to drain this slide, but understanding the types of motivations, I believe, are absolutely essential because, quite frankly, a nation-state attacker is going to have a degree of patience and a time window that is very different than a criminal who's looking for a quick hit on economic return. The other thing I think you really need to understand when looking at cyber is the full spectrum of the types of things, and these are just a few, of what can be a source of the attack. And there's one that will be near and dear to this particular industry's hearts, which is the physical attack. So we've been out there for quite some time, and I've been talking about the reality that you need to have a layered approach to security. And that really means you need to blend physical security, logical operational security, as well as security technology together. If you look at what happened with the Ukraine, it's a little bit different than what happened elsewhere. We have some examples in the U.S. where we had convergence of a physical source of attack combined with a potential cyber ramification. I think that's going to be the trajectory we see in the future. So just to give you some perspective of what I do, I worry about the third-party ecosystem, which comprises the value chain. And at Cisco, what that really means is the folks who, if you will, touch in some way our solutions, whether hardware, software, or services. And one of the pieces of things that I worry about is cyber. And I often converge my thoughts with the expertise that sits over in our information security organization and just what we need to do to defend our own network, and then try and think about how I might, much like you all are going to be doing, thinking about how you ask your suppliers what you do and how what they do fits within what you do and what the goals are. So now we move from doing prescriptive to goals and achievement of that. But just to give you some perspective, and I'm going to build this out really quickly, and there's really one in particular that I want to point out. This is just an average day of defending the Cisco network. I think it's really important for us to realize that we have a very deep focus on this, but you really need to understand the human element. So the one I always challenge people to look at is that 94% of incoming emails are blocked into our network. So we have great training, we have great trajectory knowledge across the entire workforce, whether they are our own employees or third parties. But at the end of the day, we're capturing 94% of problems in email because we're not always going to be reliant on the human element. And you need to be aware of that reality in your environment. So we all talk about this. We've deployed something a couple of years ago that I'll showcase here. We think that the concept of security being everywhere is something that is relatively easily said and not easily done. So what we did about not quite 2 years ago is we converged a new organization at Cisco called the Security and Trust Organization. And we made a commitment to bring certain senior leaders together to drive certain areas of concern around holistically thinking about security. And our first commitment was we wanted to be trustworthy to the optimum extent, transparent, and then accountable, both to ourselves, to our colleagues internally, and to the commitment that we were making to customers around the world. I think what that really made us think about was security has to be more than just a security product. It has to be more than security services. It has to really be a goal to drive integrity throughout the solutions lifecycle. And that's sort of where I came in. So what we ask of ourselves and what we challenge our customers and partners to ask of us and of themselves is, what the heck is your own value chain? Do you know what it is? What are the threats to that value chain? And how are you actually driving the right security in the right stage of that value chain at the right time? That's the ultimate goal. And I think you heard that through the reality of what NERC is doing when Larry described it, they're really not trying to be prescriptive. They're saying we understand that not all things should apply everywhere. You have to take a risk-based approach. So this just gives you a picture of what I use as the description of the value chain. It's completely usable, I believe, across multiple industries. We all have this, and it can apply to software, hardware, as well as services. But the key is understanding what's going on in each one of these stages and driving a layered approach. So the conclusion of all of that analysis 2 years ago was we had a very clear mission that I wanted to drive for the company, and that was driving pervasive security throughout that third-party ecosystem. Not easily done, but something I think that can bring us to a new level in a digitized world, and particularly in a digital economy, to a higher degree of collaboration and security success. So for us, to give you a perspective on what it looks like from an information and communications technology provider, some of our third-party ecosystem members do things like this. And you can see that there's a real divergence in the breadth and scope of either the product or the service that they offer to us. So the challenge is how to embrace this vast array of differentiated members who we're trying to drive a singular mission with. And the answer to that was really to say we need to identify for them what the threats are, and that's in security speak, and I'll share that with you, and then translate that into something they can operationally get their arms around that applies uniquely to their business. So the threats are only three. They're big and they're hairy and they're ugly, but there are only three. So we worry about manipulation, espionage, both nation state and industrial, and we also worry about disruption. That sounds great when you're talking to a security expert, but the reality is when you're talking to somebody who is managing the floor of a printed circuit board supplier, or you're talking to someone who is trying to sell you cloud security capabilities, and as a CSP, what they're actually doing is saying, I can add security on top of something, they need to understand what your exposures are, right? And so we narrowed it down to these. We're going to worry about any taint to our solution. We're going to worry about counterfeit, both at the raw material and finished solution level. We're very concerned about intellectual property misuse for a number of reasons. First, it's core to obviously why we differentiate ourselves, but also because if that IP is disclosed in an inappropriate way, the ease with which those who would engage in the effort to taint our solutions and counterfeit them, which could negatively impact our customers, could become far more swift and far more economically feasible. And then finally, worrying about information security breach inside that third-party ecosystem. So unlike what I just showed you, which is defending the Cisco network, how are the members of this ecosystem actually engaged in information security, at least with regard to the parts of their network and their processes that affect Cisco confidential information, whether it's as high a level as intellectual property, such as an ASIC design, or as seemingly low a level, not IP, but equally important, pricing information. So the commitment we made was we're going to explain this to all of you. We're going to make sure that what we do is only the right thing in the right stage at the right time, not everything everywhere, because you will sub-optimize the ultimate goal. We also said that we were going to ask the members of the third-party ecosystem to use a combination of physical security technology and logical. So it's a security triad that we are asking them to do. And then finally, we think that it's absolutely essential to sit together, and I certainly have had the privilege of working with Mark Olson and testifying before FERC, which led to the NERC effort right now, and talk with other governments around the world about the kinds of key standards, policies, and tools that we need to drive together to allow those of us who are in your vendor community to distinguish ourselves based on how we do things, but understand that there needs to be a baseline that's absolutely foundational for all of us across IT. So for us, that meant looking very carefully at what I call sort of foundational areas of discipline that need to be driven and seeing where they predominantly reside across the stages of that value chain. And I'll go through this really quickly. So none of this should come as a shock to you, but it's a really easy way to start to get people's heads wrapped around how does this relate to me. So secure development clearly in the design stage. We're worrying about information exchange and access control, and you recall that that was absolutely a fundamental element, remote access control of SIP 13. It was the second goal. We worry about this everywhere all the time, 7 by 24. Physical plant security, I worry about that everywhere except for in the planning node, because the planning node for us is done completely internally, and so our internal physical security is handled by a group outside of the Security and Trust Organization, and I have great faith in them. This one is an interesting challenge, and I said this over and over again. The challenge to security at the end of the day is us. It's the carbon-based units known as humans, right? The solution are the same thing. So trying to drive talent security and integrity, i.e. drive it through your people processes, through the way in which you measure your suppliers, understanding the supplier's commitment to some of the things that you saw, quite frankly, on what Larry had. So in the electronic industry, we came together and created actually a code of conduct that addressed labor, sustainability, intellectual property, and a whole host of other things requiring a management system to direct them. And here's why this is important. If you have people who are actually well paid, not overworked, and satisfied with the level of inquiry that they can make, as well as what they're learning in their role, when, let's say organized crime comes knocking on the back door of a loading dock, they're going to think twice before they engage in activity that facilitates nefarious activity. They're not going to take that USB stick, or they're not going to take out a chip that may be a prototype, assuming it could escape through physical security methods, and showcase it to someone. Another key area of discipline is supplier resiliency and crisis management. So, I think Tom had a really great way of showing you what security and resiliency is all about. He looked specifically at supply chain risk, but to me, supply chain risk has long been in existence, at least at Cisco and across the electronic industry. And this is a new day and age where we have to blend security as an overlay on top of overall resiliency. So driving security, for example, in times of disruption is absolutely a new model that we need to drive across the value chain. And then identifying a risk-based approach, which is an approach that really says not everything has the highest degree of care, right? You heard Larry say that. What you do with some aspects will be, let's just say, a software application that's non-critical is very different than one that is fundamental to functionality and operation control. So understanding how you want to deal both physically, and what you're actually seeing is we have a certain set of physical requirements with role-based access control that's electronically linked into the HR database, and in many cases it's actually got some biometric controls as well that says these are the kinds of things that have such a high degree of intellectual property, or they have such a high degree of potential attractiveness to theft that we want them treated in a different way, in a combination of security that's electronic as well as security that's physical. And here's a novel thought, operational as well, with track and trace and reporting by serial number. And that leads us to logistics security. So lots of people get all excited about software, and they forget about logistics security, both on hardware as well as something that I recently had the opportunity to do, and it was a cutting-edge facility, facial recognition, fantastic, and I was able to walk through and look at somebody and say, so the prototype that you're working on for one of my competitors, I'm just curious, when is that going to come out? And you could see the ashen look on the colleague's face from the third party, and they said, how did you understand that that was happening? I can't confirm that. And I said, well, it's on the whiteboard that I just walked by when I went to the lavatory in the factory. So recognizing that logistics security means physical security, and it also means information security, is something that I think is a little bit novel to those who think of logistics only as transportation and warehousing and physical. Fabrication security, what's being made where and what's being done inside those fabrication facilities, whether it's a printed circuit board location or whether it's a final assembly and test for an IT product that's tangible, or whether it's a research and development glass bowl where new prototype code for applications and convergence on SCADA systems is happening. All of that needs to be included. Finally, the last two really talk about the latter part of the life cycle. Scrap management, whether it's physical or scrap management for code, and how you deal with modules of code and how you deal with data integrity on products and that are chosen to not be included in final solutions. And then also how we deal with the way in which our customers utilize our solutions. So it's something I think all of us in the IT industry ought to be thinking about. It's very easy to say we're done, we wash our hands when we deliver it at your door, integrate it and deem that appropriate. And one of the things you saw, I think, in SIP 13 is a recognition that there actually has to be a system in place that addresses procurement controls that allow the third party to talk to you when there's a security event, to notify you of changes that might give rise to somebody ought not to be there from a personnel perspective. And then certainly most of us have what we call product security incident alerts that go out, and patches and fixes to that, or at least workarounds, and sometimes upgrades are needed. All of that is part of the sustain node that you should be looking for from the third-party community that supports you. And then what do we do when we actually end of life something? What do you do with the physical aspects? What do you do with the ASICs? What do you do with the code? What do you do when you've actually modified code specifically for somebody and it has joint IP in it? How do you handle that when it's end of life from your side versus the vendor side? So the answer to that, hopefully one answer, is what I've been building over the last couple of years. Started this and incubated it inside our supply chain operations group in 2011 and have now deployed it widely across Cisco. And what I call it is just an adaptable security architecture. I'll talk to you a little bit about it. But the beauty of what you can do is if you know what your threats are, and what your exposures are, and where you want to go from a domain perspective around security, you can then customize things so that not one size fits all. So you're not talking about things like an inner core layer, which applies only to a printed circuit board manufacturer, and no one else would actually know about when you're talking to someone who's doing warehousing. And then you have to have a coordinated deployment plan in two ways, both internally, who you work with inside your company, your enterprise, but also with that third-party ecosystem. You will not succeed without them. And then at the end of the day, a lot of the theme of trust but verify, and quite frankly what we're seeing across the board in third-party risk management, is make sure that you now embed security expectations, particularly what we'll see from the SIP 13 into the scorecard. How are you measuring your particular third party? And I'll show you an example of what we do there. And then finally, the commitment to raise the bar for all of us and join the industry discussion. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the great international standards and efforts that we've been trying to participate in, drive, and move the needle on across our own value chain. So that adaptable security architecture that I talked about really had started really with me saying, okay, what are our focus areas? What do I want to think about? And then I looked at a whole host of security requirements that were already out there. At the start, to be honest, it was over about 3,000. And interestingly enough, while I didn't have the privilege of working with Larry or Tom, I did work with colleagues at Deloitte on this. So certainly appreciated their insight. And what we came up with was about 1,200. That we thought were meaningful. We drilled down on those and we came up with what I call our 11 domains, and we have just a little bit over 180 requirements. And then they're mapped to the unique nature of activity that a third-party community member affords to Cisco relating to our solutions. So these are the 11 security domains. None of these should be shocking to any of you, and they're seemingly basic. The devil lies in how can you address these in a way that's meaningful for the diversity of your third-party vendor community that is focusing on your efforts in your enterprise. And so what we did was, the first thing was we defined them. We said we need to make sure that the taxonomy is clean and everybody understands what we're talking about. So we said this is what this domain means in plain English. And we did that for every single one of them, right? And this is always an interesting one at the end here if you look at third-tier partner security, because for us, Cisco doesn't manufacture anything itself. So if it's tangible, we're already working with multiple tiers. You have a first tier who are actually making raw materials that may go on a printed circuit board, that may go in a chassis that's actually final assembly and tested by a third-party electronic service provider or manufacturer. So when you start to think about that, you have to think about looking at your value chain partners and saying, wait a minute, I want to talk to you about who you're working with so I have some degree of comfort that you are at least addressing this downstream with your community as well, because we are only as good as our connected environment. And then the other thing was there were some words that we thought were so essential to what we meant for you to address as a goal that we had to define them. And the one that I love the most, to be honest with you, is anomaly. If you talk to 10 security experts, or quite frankly 10 experts in your industry and say what's an anomaly in operations, I bet you're going to get at least 13 answers out of those 10 people. So what we did was, to the optimum extent possible, narrow it down, although you cannot list every anomaly, give people some meaningful ideas on what we're talking about so they get a flavor for what you want them to start to alert you to. And then create a culture, quite frankly, where people don't get punished for disclosing things early, but actually rewarded for coming to you and saying, I want to tell you about this. Here's how we're working on it. By the way, can you help me on it? Can you help me with testing? What can you do together with me? And I do this all the time with third parties. It's absolutely essential. Then you go and you look at all of your requirements, and what we did was we said, well, wait a minute. We really want to be fair, as I just articulated before. Some of these things just don't make sense to apply to some of the third-party community. It's completely irrelevant to what they're affording to us. So what we did was we went into each requirement in the architecture, and we said, this does or does not apply depending on the nature of what you're doing. And you could see this goes out. It's a snapshot of a very long list. But something very different when you're engaged in design and development versus you're engaged in transportation, and so on and so forth. And it's not the end all and be all. It's a way to just think about things. It's a way to start to have a meaningful conversation with your third parties and look at somebody, and in your circumstances, to the extent something like SIP 13 will apply to you, say, I have a handle on this and I have a methodology for achieving it, and more importantly, I'm working with a third party who understands it, and here's how they're going about it. Are we all going to be perfect? Absolutely not. Does this mean there's never going to be a cyber alert? Absolutely not. But it's a way to say I'm both defending, I'm going to detect, and I'm going to mitigate in a meaningful collaborative fashion. So I think the other part of the solution here is really thinking about how you coordinate. And I certainly have a version of this that shows who I coordinate with internally, but I wanted to showcase with you who we actually coordinate with directly in each of, and it's not comprehensive, but the primary third parties that we're coordinating with at each of these stages. And understand the complexity of the differences. So for example, an OEM who makes a tangible product is very different than a cloud service provider who's providing me with, and they're nothing more to me, they're important, but they're a part of the bill of materials for a Cisco offered cloud service. They might be offering compute, they might be offering storage capacity. All of a sudden, you as a customer need to understand that I have a handle on what those CSP's security posture is because they're part of my solution. And then how I address that when that CSP for example, is over on the information security side, i.e. Cisco is consuming them, is slightly different. So I'm going to build this out just really quickly so you can see the kinds of folks that we add as foundational partners inside of each and every stage of the value chain for a Cisco solution. And remember, it's not just hardware. I have a number of people who still think about boxes, and then I have a whole host of people who are thinking about services and software. It is everything. And let's just remember open source software. It alone, combined with third-party software that is not open sourced, is a challenge that needs to be embraced in a meaningful way. So I'm just going to build this out so you get a quick gander. So I promised I'd show you an example of how you build metrics in. So obviously there's no data in this, but this is the scorecard that existed before value chain security or supply chain security existed at Cisco without that blue category. And it happens to be for an electronic manufacturing service provider. There's a number of challenges in this. The first challenge is this already was out there as a scorecard. That meant it already equaled 100%. So the first thing that I suggest you have to think about is, are the third parties in your community that you're working with including security in that scorecard, and are they negotiating with the very important other elements of what you expect as a consumer of the solution to be included? So for me, success was when security was actually on the scorecard, no different than anything else. So you can have great quality, you can have great cost savings, but if you have a problem with security, you have a problem being in my value chain. And that's difficult to do because somebody has to give something up. So there was lots of negotiation I can share with you internally. Security in this particular space because, again, as both Larry and Tom highlighted, it's a risk-based approach. This is very important. So I bumped out quite a few people because security is 38% of this particular type of scorecard. A lot of people ask, great, you have a scorecard, what does it mean? Well, what it means is you have to achieve a certain level to continue to do business with Cisco. But most importantly, you have to achieve a different level in order to be a preferred, what we would call in this space, because it's supply chain, a preferred supplier. And a preferred supplier sees things like our roadmap, has the opportunity to work with us perhaps on prototypes or write new code modules in a way that others may not. So there is a fundamental reward and business collaboration incentive rather than just the old model of how you dealt with suppliers, which is you beat them on the head with a stick until they fall down or succumb. And if you watch what the audio industry did in North America about 12 years ago, they actually did themselves harm because they beat their suppliers so mercilessly they wound up without a supply base in North America. This is a different approach. It's building things in collaboratively. And that leads, quite frankly, to another collaborative effort, which is sitting at the table jointly with competitors, taking our hats off and saying, what is it that we want to drive across the IT industry to address this? These are just a small subsection of things, but they are some of the ones that we believe are most prevalent, talking about supply chain and value chain and third-party risk from an international standard, a procurement standard, and then, of course, obviously we have the order that Larry talked about in detail today. The other thing is to recognize that cybersecurity is also intrinsically linked with a set of area of crime and terrorism, and we need to be conscious of that, and we've certainly looked at that globally and said these are not compliance mandates. These are voluntary programs. But what they actually can do for you is allow you to raise the bar across your value chain and within your own organization, because these are enterprise perspectives, not just value chain, and think about what you are doing in a whole host of areas that are focused on criminal and terrorism combating efforts. So with that said, I think the other thing we need to do to actually reduce risk, particularly in the cyber area, is look at technological experimentation. because as wonderful as we humans are, we also can be the cause of major problems, and security technology on the cyber side can really help us. So I have a number of hardware-based experiments that are looking at firmware and software in their firmware manifestation. But some of them are forensics, and this happens to be one. So, we're looking at using software to actually capture and do analysis of printed circuit board assemblies as they come off the surface mount technology assembly line so that we have them for forensic analysis. We are also looking at how we secure boundary scan, which is a fancy way of saying when you are looking at a printed circuit board that's assembled, you actually scan around the outside as the ports to test for quality, electrical connectivity, and even some mechanical steps. And the reality is, to somebody who's a security expert, I look at that and I go, that's fantastic. I'm so thrilled that we have it. I'm also really frightened because to me that's a neon sign that says, enter here, right here. And what can we do to secure that and still facilitate the in-circuit testing that's necessary for the highest degree of quality? Working with our colleagues in the semiconductor industry to think about how we can get our hands as an OEM on electronic chip IDs. And if our semiconductor partners can use physical unclonable chip functions as a way that there is, you can't change this. It is not changeable. It helps me on the counterfeit side. Thinking as well about provenance across operations, we have a patent waiting, which is a combination of signed data and near-field communication to give us a higher degree of fidelity across the operational flow. And then the latest thing, which is really burgeoning and very, very new, and I'll have the privilege of talking about at the RSA conference, we're working with Professor Mark Taranapur down at the University of Florida on this concept of making math work for us. Very, very simple. If I have a chip, there's a derived expression that comes out of it. It's a math algorithm. If there's a remainder, it should equal 0 at the end. If there's a remainder, I have a problem. And all of a sudden, instead of wondering where the problem is, it gives me a nice way to zone in. So the medical analogy would be, rather than doing all the scans that we do today in medicine to say, well, is it in the geo of your intestinal system? Is it in the geo of your brain? Is it in your bones? This tells me, look here. So I think these are sort of a set of criteria that we can use, and I know there were some real questions on cyber insurance as well as contracts, and I'm not quite sure, Bob, if you want me to tackle those, you want all three of us to tackle them, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. That was a wonderful description of what you're doing there, and it's really serious stuff. And, but the polynomial stuff, I'm just really curious to see about that. That might justify me going to RSA just to hear that talk, so that's cool. So there you go. So yeah, if you can see the questions on your screen, yeah, I'd be happy for you to take the first shot at them, and if Larry or Tom want to chime in. The first one was asked probably about an hour ago, so apologies, but I did try to the end. It's how you apply standards like this to somebody who's the same size as you, like Microsoft. I mean, you guys work together a lot, but how easy or hard is that to get things working with a truly large supplier?
I think it's a great question. I think it might be hard to get it into contract language per se, but I think if you heard what Larry articulated, we like to have a relationship with our customers. So sit down, and I had the privilege of looking at the Edison Electric Institute's guide on supply chain and cyber that they were sending out to their CIOs and their CISOs. It's a partnership, so sit down and say, look, how are you going to help me comply with SIP 13 when it comes out? It's a great question. Well, let us show you what we're doing. I just showed you some of what we're doing. What can we do to make it better? That's a question I always ask. But I'll be blunt. It might be difficult to embed it into contract language with hardcore penalties, and I think the goal is actually not punitive. The goal is to raise the bar. It's as transparent and honest as I can give an answer. Larry, Tom, I don't know if you want to add your expertise given your diverse experience with your clients.
Take that as a no. Okay. The other question that you mentioned was the one about trends on cybersecurity liability coverage. I'm really interested to hear what any of the three speakers have to say about cybersecurity liability insurance. So Edna, I'll let you go first, and then Tom and Larry, if you want to chip in, please.
So, Tom and Larry may have more visibility on trends since they look at a broad spectrum of industries and clients. My observation is that at the outset, folks were thinking about it as a panacea, and I don't think it is. I think it's one piece of the puzzle, and folks need to recognize that what it covers is not some of the things you may be critically worried about, right? So it covers the losses up to a certain extent that you incur as a result of a breach. But imagine if, and the example I always give people is, imagine if the breach was the release of Coke's formula, which they have kept as a trade secret for all these years, and it's now in the hands of PepsiCo. There's no cybersecurity liability coverage for that.
Good point.
Yeah, this is Larry, and I can jump in on that too. I would say, what Edna described is completely accurate. Coverage is not a panacea. I mean, it might help to make up or mitigate for some potential financial losses. Certainly not a reputational loss or your Coke example, where that's the worst possible outcome that you could imagine, right? But it's that insurance coverage is certainly something that general counsels across our client base are getting a better understanding of, and certainly evaluating as part of their overall insurance related coverage.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to jump down to another question that was just asked, and I think, Edna, this is for you again. How do you protect against globalization disruption, natural, political, third-party suppliers? Do you have backup relationships in place? What's your resiliency, I guess, is what
no, that goes brilliantly to the foundation of the tradition in supply chain resilience, right, and risk management. So we do it in a number of ways. We are Cisco, so of course there's math and a tool involved, but we long ago had an algorithm that has continued to morph, so we require a whole set of information from third-party community members. And look, anybody who's ever run a supply chain understands the last thing you want to do is be beholden to a single supplier. It's just bad for pricing, forget anything else, right? Sometimes you can't always achieve that if you're dealing with cutting-edge technology. There may be one or two folks out there who actually can play in the arena that you are in until it becomes more prevalent and pervasive. But we have a pretty heavy matrix of a whole host of things that just were in, I think were in Tom's slides, and things like financial status. Where are they? What is the reality of the geopolitical environment and the legal system in which they are located? What is the reality of the labor force, trends in the labor force? What is the reality of laws on IP protection and enforceability where they reside? So I could keep going, right? Acts of we worry about, are they in an earthquake zone? Are they, what's the actual geographic ramification on instability? And then you go into the whole area of what are they doing on environmental sustainability? What are they doing on social responsibility so that we know that they have a workforce that isn't, going to be engaged in either nefarious activity because they're angry or a workforce that is suboptimal in their focus because they don't feel free to innovate. All of those things are important. And then I think in this day and age, we all have to look at the social media footprint of the employees and the community around that third-party member. So we actually do a pretty comprehensive set of reviews like that and do business continuity planning on a routine basis with that third-party community. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I would love to tell you that we know every time an earthquake is going to come, but we sure as heck have a way to deal with those kinds of events. And we try to forecast, and have redundancy or diversity across the supplier portfolio in that third-party community.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So we're like about a half a minute from being done here. And thank you for those answers, Edna. I had promised Deloitte that I would put their contact information up, so it's here. It's here on the screen now. It's also going to be in the slide deck that we'll make available on utc.org. We do have 2 questions left, but they both look like they're going to take longer than 30 seconds to answer. So I think what I'll do for those 2 of you, I'll make sure that we get answers offline. I think it'll be pretty straightforward, but we're just out of time here. And I really was blown away by the content of all 3 presenters today. I'm so thankful that you guys agreed to do this session. And as intractable a problem as supply chain risk management seems, I mean, I think what we heard today is that there's a lot of real-world common sense stuff you can do. It ain't easy, but it is doable. And that to me is the reassuring message, that and the hopefully less prescriptive approach that NERC and FERC will take as that stuff comes to fruition. So I'm about to pick off my line here, so I'm going to thank everybody for your time. Tom, Larry, and Edna, thank you so much for your great presentations today. Want to let everybody know that you can reach me through email. Just itot@utc.org is the easiest way. That's IT like information technology, OT like operations technology, itot@utc.org. That'll come to my mailbox. If you want to get in touch with any of our speakers, their contact information is in their slides, or send me an email and I'll make sure you get in touch. So all that said, thank you very much for your time. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers, and that concludes our call.
Thanks a million, folks.